Welcome to an overview of the risk analysis process. Risk analysis is a systematic way of identifying decision problems, then gathering and evaluating evidence that can lead to recommendations for a decision or action in response to an identified risk. It is a process that has evolved specifically for decision-making under uncertainty. It consists of three tasks: risk management, risk assessment, and risk communication. Risk analysis examines the whole of a risk by assessing the risk and its related relevant uncertainties for the purpose of efficacious management of the risk, facilitated by effective communication about the risk. Risk analysis has evolved into a paradigm for decision-making under uncertainty. It recognizes that we may be uncertain about one or more aspects of the consequence or the likelihood of a risk of concern. Subsequently, risk analysis is intentional in the way it directs analysts and decision-makers alike to base their decisions on the available science while paying appropriate attention to the remaining uncertainty. In Notre Dame of Maryland University's program, risk analysis is the overarching concept. It envelops all the other related ideas and activities. ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, takes another view of risk analysis. The ISO defines risk management as the overarching concept. The ISO risk management process comprises 5 steps: communication and coordination, establishing the context, risk assessment, which includes risk identification, risk analysis, and risk evaluation, risk treatment, monitoring and review. Notice that risk analysis is considered to be part of the risk assessment step within the risk management process. Don't be disheartened by this confusing terminology. Simply be well aware of it, and that will save you a great deal of confusion when you begin to read and converse about the subject of risk. The good news is that there is far more unity of agreement about how to do these things than there is about what we call them. So to recap, in the Notre Dame of Maryland University program, we are going to talk about risk analysis and its 3 primary tasks of risk management, risk assessment, and risk communication. But there are other views of how the language should be used. Risk analysis is for decision-making under uncertainty. As expected then, uncertainty is the key to using risk analysis. When uncertainty is great and the consequences of a wrong decision are serious, risk analysis is needed. When there is little uncertainty, or the consequences of a mistake are minor, other decision paradigms will work just as well. The lower left quadrant describes activities like personnel assignments, routine purchases, data collection, routine coordination and administrative activities, responding to constituents, and the like. These are routine tasks with little uncertainty, or situations where a wrong decision will have trivial or easily reversed consequences. Moving to the lower right, we define a class of decision problems where there may well be significant amount of uncertainties, but the consequence of a decision mistake are relatively minor. These situations require a modest amount of risk analysis. That might mean doing at least enough analysis to reassure decision makers that the consequences of a mistake are indeed slight. Examples of such decisions could include some routine or reoccurring aspects of the organization or enterprise's primary decision-making functions, managing projects, allocating operation and maintenance resources, and so on. As the consequence of a mistake grow more serious, the need for more rigorous and routine risk analysis grows as well. A presumed normal situation for decision-making in many organizations is one with relatively less uncertainty but potentially serious consequences for a decision error. Risk analysis is presumed to be a routine part of such decision-making processes. Ideally, it will be the organization's dominant decision-making paradigm. Examples of such areas include recurring but always unique situations. Let me use the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, for whom I've done a great deal of work, as an example here. The Corps of Engineers is charged with managing many of the United States water resource quantity issues. They deal with issues like lake siltation, reservoir reallocation, flooding, storm protection, ecosystem restoration, dam and levee safety programs, and so on. These are tasks that routinely require a risk analysis approach. The need for the greatest amount of risk analysis occurs for those decisions with both a lot of uncertainty and potentially severe consequences for a decision error. This is where the most rigorous risk analysis is needed. When the uncertainty is great enough, adaptive management techniques may be needed to reduce the uncertainty to support decision making. Continuing with the Corps of Engineers examples for this quadrant might include such things as the evaluation of levees that followed Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, or the Great Lakes Mississippi River Interbasin Study that dealt with the risk of aquatic nuisance species moving from one basin to the other. The bottom line is simple. The more uncertainty there is, the more risk analysis is needed to support decision making. The risk analysis process begins and ends with the risk management step. This is one logical reason why several risk lexicons consider risk management the overarching concept instead of risk analysis. Risk management consists of identifying a problem, defining the decision context, requesting the information needed to make that decision, evaluating risks after they are assessed, and initiating action to identify, evaluate, select, implement, monitor, and modify actions taken to alter levels of unacceptable risk to acceptable or tolerable levels, as opposed to taking no action at all. More informally, risk management is the work one has to do to ask and answer the questions that follow. What is the problem? What information do we need to solve the problem? That is, what questions do we want risk assessment to answer? What can be done to reduce the impact of the risk described? What can be done to reduce the likelihood of the risk described? What are the trade-offs of the available options? What is the best way to address the described risk? And once the risk management measure is implemented, is it working? Risk management strategies that address risks of loss are called risk reduction strategies. Risk avoidance either reduces the likelihood or the impact of the consequences to zero so that the risk no longer exists. Risk prevention strategies reduce the likelihood of adverse consequences. Although the likelihood of the risk may not be reduced to zero, it may be reduced to a level considered acceptable, or at least tolerable. Risk mitigation strategies reduce the magnitude of a risk by reducing the impact of the consequences. This may be done by changing the nature, magnitude, duration, or frequency of the negative consequences. Risk transfer is a strategy for identifying stakeholders better able to manage the risk, or finding a way to share a risk among many stakeholders. In the extreme, this means passing the liability and responsibility for action to another stakeholder. Insurance is an example of risk pooling, a popular form of risk transfer. Risk retention is necessary when no means exist for reducing a risk, or when the residual risks cannot be reduced to a tolerable level. When faced with an opportunity for an uncertain gain, the risk manager must decide whether or not to assume the risk of taking an action that could result in less than the expected, desired, or even necessary outcome. This is the risk-taking role of the risk manager. Creating an opportunity with an uncertain outcome is taking a risk. Increasing the likelihood of a positive outcome from 0 to a positive value, or creating circumstances for a new positive outcome to accompany events already occurring with some likelihood, are examples of risk creation. Enhancing a risk involves increasing the likelihood that an event or desired outcome will occur. Exploiting a risk seeks to increase the impact of the opportunity in order to maximize the benefit from the project or activity undertaken. Risk sharing seeks a partner able to manage the opportunity so that the likelihood of it happening or the potential benefits resulting from it can be maximized. Ignoring a risk is choosing to take no action to realize an opportunity. Risk assessment is a systematic process for describing the nature, likelihood, and magnitude of a risk associated with some substance, situation, action, or event that includes consideration of the relevant uncertainties. Risk assessment provides an understanding of risks and their causes, their consequences, and likelihoods or probabilities. Risk assessment provides a basis for making decisions about the most appropriate risk management option to be used to treat the risks that are judged to be unacceptable. Risk assessment outputs are to be used as input to the enterprise's decision-making processes. Risk assessment is informally described by asking and answering the following questions that build on the Kaplan and Garrick triplet. What can go wrong? How can it happen? What are the consequences? How likely is it to happen? Risk assessment is the step that gathers the evidence, answers the risk manager's questions, and identifies and addresses the uncertainty that remains in the decision problem. It's the positive task of risk analysis, whereas risk management is the normative task of risk analysis. Good risk assessment analyzes the causes of the risk to determine their contribution to the consequences and their likelihood of occurrence. Thus, risk assessment can provide valuable insight into the most effective ways to further treat unacceptable risks. There are many risk assessment models found in the literature. For now, we'll consider a rather generic four-step model that is broad enough to cover both pure and speculative risks. Step 1 is to look for the hazard or opportunity. This is where you would identify the hazards that can cause harm or the opportunities for gain that are uncertain. Step 2 is the consequence assessment. Here you decide who or what may be harmed or benefited and in what ways. Gather and analyze the relevant data, characterize the consequences and their uncertainty, either qualitatively or quantitatively. The third step is likelihood assessment. Here you assess the likelihood of the various adverse and beneficial consequences and characterize these likelihoods and their uncertainty, either qualitatively or quantitatively. The fourth step is risk characterization. Here you estimate the probability of occurrence, the severity of adverse consequences, and the magnitude of potential gains, including the attendant uncertainties of the hazards and opportunities identified based on the evidence in the preceding steps. You will also characterize the risk qualitatively or quantitatively with appropriate attention to baseline and residual risks, risk reductions, transformations, and transfers. Here's a figure illustrating the risk assessment model used to evaluate the risk of aquatic nuisance species moving from the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River and vice versa. We'll use the assessment of the probability of establishment, shown on the left side of the model, to illustrate examples of qualitative and quantitative risk assessment in the slides that follow. Before doing that, let's talk about risk characterization. The risk characterization step of the risk assessment describes the risk in a manner suitable for supporting decision-making by risk managers. A good risk characterization usually includes at least one risk estimate and a description of the estimate. A risk estimate is an estimate of the likelihood and severity of the adverse effects or potential opportunities which addresses key attending uncertainties. It combines the estimate of the consequences and their likelihood to describe the overall level of risk. Quantitative estimates are numerical in nature and are preferred over qualitative estimates. Risk estimates should include all the relevant aspects of the risk. These may encompass existing, future, historical, reduced, residual, new, transformed, and transferred risks. A risk description is a narrative explanation and depiction of a risk that bounds and defines a risk for decision-making purposes. It's the story that accompanies the risk estimate and explains what the risk estimate means in a way that risk managers and others can understand. Qualitative risk assessment is distinguished by its lack of reliance on numerical expressions of risk. Instead, qualitative risk assessments depend on risk descriptions, narratives, and relative values, often obtained by ranking or separating risks into descriptive categories like high, medium, low, and no risk, as shown in the table here. When the relative values are numeric, but nominal or ordinal in character, such as when index numbers are used, the risk estimate is said to be semi-quantitative, but they remain more qualitative than quantitative in nature. Quantitative risk assessment relies on numerical expressions of risk. Here the probability of establishment for an aquatic nuisance species is expressed numerically. A quantitative risk assessment can be a deterministic point estimate, as seen in cell G1, or a probabilistic estimate, such as an interval or the entire probability distribution, as is also shown here. Quantitative analysis is preferred when it's possible. Full quantitative analysis may not always be possible or desirable due to insufficient information about the decision problem, lack of data, unclear social preferences, and many other factors. In some instances, the resources and effort needed for quantitative analysis may not be warranted or required, even though the analysis is possible. Risk communication is the open, two-way exchange of information and opinion between risk analysts and their stakeholders and various publics. They communicate about risks intended to lead to a better understanding of the risks and better risk management decisions. Risk communication provides a forum for the interchange of information with all concerned about the nature of the risks, the risk assessment, and how risks should be managed. Risk communication may be informally characterized by asking and answering the following questions, first proposed by Chess and Hance in 1994. Why are we communicating? Who are our audiences? What do our audiences want to know? How will we communicate? How will we listen? How will we respond? Who will carry out the plans and when? What problems or barriers have we planned for? Have we succeeded? There are two thrusts in risk communication: internal risk communication and external risk communication. The internal risk communication task ensures effective interaction between risk managers and risk assessors. 3 rules of thumb for this task are: collaborate early, coordinate often, cooperate always. External risk communication requires risk managers, assessors, and risk communicators to interact with their various publics and external stakeholders. The extent of this interaction will depend on how public the risk management activity is. Not every risk management activity will require external risk communication. Decisions internal to an organization, for example, will be wholly contained within that organization. When external communication is warranted, 4 broad categories of tasks can be identified. They are risk communication, crisis communication, public involvement, and conflict resolution. Experts in the public interpret risk in very different ways, and this complicates risk communication. Risk involves scientific facts, as well as people's feelings in response to the manner in which the risk is perceived. That perception may or may not align well with the facts of the risk. These competing dimensions of risk, the objective versus the subjective, create some unique communication challenges. Peter Sandman said the technical side of risk, often the greater concern of the risk analyzing organization, focuses on the magnitude and probability of undesirable outcomes. For example, the strength and aerial extent of an earthquake, its recurrence interval, the damages it can cause, the ability of a structure to withstand it, and the likelihood that load will exceed capacity, and the extent of failure if it does. He called these technical details and facts hazard. The public, by contrast, focuses on the non-technical side of the risk. This is the social context of the risk, and this focus involves values and emotions. The public cares more about their losses than they do about the details of the earthquakes themselves. Losing a grandmother's vase, a pet, or a place to live matters more than a recurrence interval. Concerns like whether the risk is voluntary or coerced, familiar or exotic, dreaded or not dreaded, and whether an organization is considered trustworthy or untrustworthy, responsive or unresponsive. These things are important to the public. Sandman calls all this outrage. Technical experts are more occupied by and concerned with the hazard aspects of a risk. As experts, they think about these problems and know things that others do not. The public is less concerned with the science, numbers, and facts of the risk than they are with the outrage factors, the personal and social context of the risk. The public has feelings about the risk. They believe things to be true or not, often without respect to the facts of a situation. The public is less concerned with the probabilities of an earthquake than they are with the relative importance of what might be lost. These two distinct dimensions of a risk can lead to a disconnect between experts and the public. Experts, for example, may worry about how to explain a technical aspect of a risk that the public does not care about, while they devote little time to understanding what the public's concerns are. This disconnect between hazard and outrage leads to several different kinds of risk communication strategies, as seen in the figure. 3 common risk communication goals are: first, tailor your communication so it takes into account the emotional response to an event. Second, empower the audience to make informed decisions. Third, prevent negative behavior and/or encourage constructive responses to crisis or danger.